Hi, I'm Bridget Palmer. Today we're going to talk about reading strategies for academic texts. This is a very practical lecture. In the beginning, I'm going to have you ask yourself some questions to think about your history with reading and kind of what it is that you've done in the past and what it is that you're trying to do now for academic purposes. But then what we're going to do is we're going to look at tools and then we're going to practice using them. So it's really a practical session. By the end, you should have some great strategies for working with academic texts in English. First, I want you to ask yourself some questions. How do you feel about reading? You're going to come to your academic reading experience with feelings about reading and how that's been working for you. So I want you to ask yourself, for example, what kinds of strategies are you already using for reading academic texts? And the answer may be none, but you can think about that and see what you've done in the past, what's worked for you, what's not worked for you. Then I want you to think about, do you think you need to improve your reading skills? Now, since you're listening to this lecture, I'm guessing the answer to that is yes or probably, but be thinking why or in what ways, what has led you here? And last, I want you to think about what kinds of texts have you been or are you reading and for what purposes? For many of you, I'm guessing that you've been reading for pleasure in your spare time, but I also want you to think about how that is going to be different from texts that you're reading for academic purposes. And we'll look at that more in the next slide. So think about these questions. What have you already been doing? What is your past experience? And what kinds of texts have you been reading? Okay, so comparing the reading that you've done in the past to the reading that you need to do now for academic purposes, we're going to look at three things. When you're reading an academic text, you need to be active, efficient, and critical. Let's look at each of those things. First, when you're reading actively, that means that when you're looking at a text, you're going to be looking for the structure of the text. You're going to be reading very carefully. You're going to be asking yourself questions about the text and trying to understand what it is that the writer wants you to know. Next, you're going to need to read efficiently, and that means making the most of your time. You're going to be reading through, getting the meaning that you need, and then moving on. And that may sometimes mean moving past difficult sections. Yes, I'm actually in this lecture telling you that sometimes you might need to skip sections to be able to understand a text better. Now, it's this area where it's the biggest difference between reading for academic purposes and reading for kind of your own leisure time purposes. So when you're reading academic text, you're not starting at page 1, sitting on the couch and reading until whenever you feel like stopping or at the end of the book. You really need to read efficiently and make sure you're moving through the text. Lastly, you need to read critically. And this is another big difference between just reading novels or some kind of fiction for non-academic purposes. When you're reading academically, you need to read critically, and that means making judgments about a text and learning to ask the right questions. So really thinking about what you've just read and seeing what you can get out of it. So when we're thinking about reading academically, there is a well-known reading strategy that you can try. It goes by several different names. What we call it here is SQ3R. You may have heard of this before, but let's take a look at what SQ3R means. So SQ3R stands for, as you can see, survey, question, and then read, recall, review, or you'll sometimes see it as read, recite, review. And this is a helpful strategy for reading, especially when it comes to academic texts. Something I want you to notice about the steps in SQ3R is that reading comes third. When this is a reading strategy, but reading is not the first thing that you do, and that's something I really want you to pay attention to. When you're doing your academic reading, I want you to remember that reading is not the first thing that you do. There's other things that you do first, and that's really going to help you in the process. It might seem counterintuitive. You might be tempted to just get through your books as fast as you can, pick them up and start at page 1, but I'm telling you, there's things you can do first that are really going to increase your understanding of those academic texts. So the first step in SQ3R is survey. And what surveying is you're flipping through the text. You're seeing things like who wrote this, when was it published, are there sections, are there chapters, are there charts, are there pictures, how long is it, how long do I need to read, what does the professor want me to do. You can see this if you were to think about what this looks like, it really looks like flipping through the text. You're turning pages quickly, you're scanning up and down, you're not reading for meaningful information at this point. You're kind of surveying overall and seeing what is the task ahead of you. The next step of SQ3R is question, and this is, in my opinion, the most important step. Question is where you're going to ask yourself, what is it that I need to learn from this text? Are there questions I'm trying to answer? Now, there may be actual questions that you're trying to answer that your professor has given you. Maybe there's some reading comprehension questions, or it may be that you know you have an exam later this week about this text, and maybe you have an idea of the questions that will be on the exam. So there may be actual questions given to you by the professor, or you may need to be more self-directed and think for yourself, what is my objective for this section of reading that I'm going to do right now? What is it that I'm trying to find out? And as we'll see when we practice in just a minute, sometimes those questions can be kind of given to you by the text itself. We'll take a look at that in a few minutes. Then, as I said before, comes reading. So notice that's not the first thing that you've done. First, you've had a look, you've asked yourself some questions, maybe even written them down, and then you read, right? Now, after you read, you're going to recall or review. And what this is going to do is you're going to do something with the information that you just got out of the text. Maybe you'll do a little presentation for yourself. Maybe you'll write down some notes. Maybe you'll test yourself on what you've learned. Maybe you write a summary. Maybe you discuss it with other people in your class. You're going to want to do something to kind of activate and then review that information. And you can do that as often as you need before an exam or before writing an essay or something like that. This should be an ongoing process after reading. Now I'm going to take you through 3 different texts, and we're going to just practice SQ3R on each of them briefly. If it were your own text, you could spend a little bit longer, but I just want to get through kind of a variety of texts and show you how this looks in practice. These are the sample texts that I've grabbed to practice SQ3R with. These are actual texts that students have asked for help with, that they've been using. So we've got psychology, we've got kind of philosophy, and we've got medicine. So these are 3 different books that we're going to look at, and they are e-books so that I can show them to you on a screen. In real life, you may have a physical book, but try to imagine the same process but with a physical book, your own text. So now that we've talked about SQ3R, we can look at an actual text, right, and see how it looks in real life. So here I have the first of the ebooks that I mentioned. It's about psychology, and if I were going to be surveying it physically, I'd have it flipped open in my hands, but here I'm going to be scrolling. So I can see I've got How to Think Straight About Psychology. It's about a person named Keith Danovich. I don't know that author, but there may be times where you do know something about an author, and that can help inform what's going to happen with this book. But here I can see it's about 200 pages. I've got 11 different chapters. And if I continue to survey, I might click around and kind of see if there's charts or graphs or anything. I don't see any. I do see just a lot of text, but with some subheadings. So that's going to help my understanding, isn't it? Looking a little bit closer, but still surveying, I can see that each chapter seems to have kind of a concept, and then it almost looks like there's kind of a story that's going to illustrate each concept, and then it kind of goes on to teach me about that. So that's helpful, and that actually makes this more approachable, doesn't it? I can start a chapter with a story, that's fine with me, and then kind of go on to learn about something. Now, next step is question. With questioning, I may have actual questions for an exam or an essay from my professor, or I may need to kind of look internally and think what I'm actually wanting to learn. So that's going to be my overall question, right? Here for this chapter, if I'm looking here, falsifiability. I might be asking myself, what is falsifiability? What does this story about green men have to teach me about it? There might be, what are some theories of falsifiability? What are the criteria for falsifiability? And here I'm looking at subheadings. What is the theory of knocking rhythms? You can see these are basic questions, but they're going to help structure my understanding, right? So then, of course, I would read. And in reading, if I can move through the text, that's what I'm going to want to do through however many pages that it takes. And then afterward, of course, I'm going to review or somehow activate this learning. I might go back, look at the questions I wrote down, try to answer them without looking at the text. That's going to be a really good way of reviewing, right? So again, that was quite quick, but that was one way to get through this first book. Here I'm looking at this Deviance and Medicalization, another book. Let's look at what survey is going to look like here. So again, it's a little untraditional because it's an ebook, but here I can see I've got some front matter, I've got a foreword, I've got a preface, and then a table of contents. But I can see, actually, if I keep scrolling, I can see the chapters. So here I can kind of look through, and here it seems to be kind of moving through time almost, doesn't it? If we're looking at, first this looks like a general overview, and then we've got kind of social issues here, mental illness, then moving on to alcohol, opiates, kind of kids and ADD, and then homosexuality. So I can see that's kind of moving through these major themes in medicine and almost kind of going through time up to the present day. You'll notice that I did not spend hardly a moment looking at the front matter or the foreword or the preface. Unless your professor has told you that specifically you need to read a foreword or a preface, I would say in general it's not necessary. You do not need to start at page 1. You can start at wherever it is that you need to be reading for the exam or essay or whatever it is. Okay? So again, here I can see, I know stuff about these. I may not know the technical issues, but I know some things about, for example, alcoholism. You can start thinking about what you already know, and then ask yourself questions. You can also see that just from these little introduction bits, can you see in this chapter we discuss, that's an example of English metatext. It's telling you exactly what's coming, and that can be very helpful when I'm trying to read. If this is talking about the origins and rise of the idea, about intoxication, well then there's my question, right? What is the origin? How can we explain the rise? Those are my questions. They're coming straight from this metatext right here. That's really helpful. Then, of course, I'd read and then review, right? Let's look at our last text. This is about philosophy, riddles of existence. You can see slightly different presentation of this ebook. I'm clicked on the table of contents here, and I can see I've got some really big topics for each chapter. I'm just surveying and seeing what I'm going to be learning about. We've got free will and fatalism and possibility and kind of ending with what is metaphysics. I can see the title of the book is A Guided Tour of Metaphysics. So it's kind of taking us through some issues and then ending with kind of the main question there. So here I've kind of surveyed and seen what's going on. I see it's about 150 pages. And if I were to click through to some chapters, I might be able to see if there's going to be pictures or anything like that. Okay, well, I can't click through right now. But then I'm going to generate my questions and then read through and then review after. So that's what SQ3R can look like in real life using ebooks, and that should help you. Again, the most important thing is to generate your questions and really read for a purpose. And then when you're reviewing, you can just go back and answer those questions, and that's going to be really helpful. Okay, so now you've had a look at how SQ3R looks in practice, and now I want you to be thinking about, now that you've looked at a few kind of English texts and getting, refreshing your memory about what English academic texts look like, I want you to think to yourself, how may those be different from Finnish academic texts that you're used to reading? And this can be very useful because it helps you kind of shift your thinking and really understand some of the differences, and that way you manage your expectations. I don't want you going into an English text expecting that it'll be exactly the same as a Finnish text. So let's take a look. Here I can see some differences in structure and placement and meta text between Finnish and English academic texts. I hope what you can see on the left is that Finnish texts tend to be implicit. It's up to the reader to make sense of the meaning, right? Whereas in English, we expect the writer to make that meaning clear. So it's very explicit what the text is trying to get you to learn, or it should be. If we're looking at information placement and kind of the main point, Finnish texts are going to go from very broad, from a distance, and then kind of narrow in on the conclusion by the end. Whereas in English, you will notice that these texts will often tell you their most important points and even their result or conclusion from the very beginning. So English academic texts can start to seem like they're really repeating themselves. Like it told me something and then it just kept telling me about it, and finally it told me about it one more time in the conclusion. That's very typical of English academic texts. And finally, this last point about meta text. Finnish academic texts tend to have less text about text, whereas in English we have more text about text. English academic writing tends to include kind of more clues about the structure and the path of development of the ideas, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a moment. So what is this meta text that we were just talking about? How do English texts tell me how to read them? Well, in this lecture, I'll tell you about one major way, and that is signposting. You may have heard of signposting, or you may have heard it called transition words or something like that. But the idea is this is language that we use in English that kind of tells us what's coming next, or tells us how to interpret the text or understand relationships between one paragraph and the next paragraph, or even one sentence and the next sentence. So these are going to tell us things like, oh, here comes more information, here's cause and effect, maybe examples or emphasizing something, contrasts or similarities, shifts in time or time period, and then signaling maybe the end of a text. So just think for a second, what kinds of language signal these changes? And then I'll show you some examples. So here is an excerpt from an article about the far right in Europe. It's a political science text, and I've given you just the first part of a sentence to kind of help you start to recognize signposting words. So here we can see the sentence, although some find that unemployment helps far right parties, ... So there is something coming next, and we can even kind of sense what's coming next, and that is because of signposting. So if I take a look and see what the signposting word is, what would you think it is? What word here is signaling some kind of a, here maybe it's a contrast or a change in the next part of the sentence? Think about it. You can see it is although. So the word although is a signposting word, and it's giving us some specific information about what is coming next. So now think to yourself, what might be coming next in this sentence? Of course, you're not going to be able to say the exact words, but you should be able to kind of characterize the idea of what's coming next. And if we look, we can see that it's something like most find that either has no effect or hurts them. Do you see that contrast? Even if you couldn't tell the exact words, you should have been able to feel that signal from although, that something different was coming. This is signposting, and English academic texts use signposting to help you as the reader to understand their message. So if you can identify signposting in your academic texts, you should be able to understand the relationships between or within sentences, between sentences, and then from paragraph to paragraph until eventually signposting can help you understand the entire structure of a text. So here I've grabbed a paragraph from Riddles of Existence. This is our philosophy text that I mentioned earlier. And this is a paragraph, and I'm setting out to read it, or I'm starting to read it, and I'm just looking for any kind of hint or help that's going to help me get through this text, right? So if I look carefully, I'm going to notice something. All throughout this paragraph are some signposting words. I can see though and simply and also and for instance and clearly and so and all kinds of things. These signposting words are going to help me move from concept to concept in this paragraph and help me understand this text better. So get used to kind of singling out these signposting words and really letting them guide me through the text and tell me what's coming next. You can find, if you Google signposting words or transition words, you should be able to find lists of signposting words, but ideally you really feel these more than you memorize them. As you read more, you'll start to be able to sense signposting words and not have to depend on looking on a list. Now I'm going to show you a few tools that you can use to help you work with texts. Some of these tools depend on copying and pasting maybe chunks of your articles, so that's going to depend on if you have an ebook or a URL for those texts. But you can also use them with things that you generate yourself. So first you can see is the academic word list. Second is Rewordify, and then two tools from LexTutor, which are the keyword extractor and vocab profiler. Let's look at some of these tools that I mentioned just now. So the first is the academic word list. This is something developed in New Zealand by someone named Avril Coxhead a few years ago, and what she's done is she has analyzed journal articles, so a huge corpus, a huge collection of academic texts. And she's identified the words that are used most frequently, the 570 words that are used most frequently in those academic texts. And that is accounting for any kind of specialist words. She didn't include words from specific subheadings of science. It's just general academic words. So if I were to scroll here, you can see the kinds of words that are included in that list. If you go to Google, you can find all kinds of activities and kind of more user-friendly lists. On Quizlet, for example, there's Quizlet lists of these academic words. But you can see, you probably know a lot of these words already. But understand, if there's some that you don't know, you can study them and learn, and then you can understand academic text better, right? If you know all these 570 words. So that's kind of one basic tool. This is in list form, but again, you can find it in all kinds of places on the internet. Academic word list. The next tool that you can use is called rewordify.com, and this is going again to depend on having an electronic copy of whatever it is you're trying to analyze. I've grabbed a paragraph from one of our example texts from the deviance and medicalization text, and I'm just going to paste it here and then say rewordify, and let's see what we can do with this. So I've pasted it in, and it's kind of defaulted to this. I'm going to take a look at the settings and see what I can do differently and make sense of this a little more. So what it's done is it's grabbing the words that it deems as difficult, and you can tell it how difficult you want it to be. Maybe I feel like, oh, well, those words that it's doing are actually a little bit too easy. So I'm going to say, let's go to level 2, and that's going to say there are 16 difficult words only. What you can say is you want it to actually replace those difficult words with a meaning, or you can say, I want to see them together. You know, I still want to see that difficult word. I just want to also see it defined off to the right. You can also change the colors if you like, but I do like that yellow-purple. So there's, again, different things that you can have it do, but this is maybe how I would like to do it. And then we can say save and close, and what it'll do is then you have the original on the left, the rewordified on the right, and then you can read through and see these difficult words defined for you off to the side, all automatically, and that can save you a lot of time and effort, right, when you're reading through a text that's full of difficult vocabulary. So that's rewordify. There are lots of other things that you can do. If you wanted to play with parts of speech, for example, and say, well, I'm really having a lot of trouble with my maybe my prepositions and my verbs. I'd really like to see those highlighted. Well, you can just go ahead and say, I'd like to see prepositions and verbs. And that can help you focus on that if that's what you want to do. So again, this turns into not just a comprehension tool, but kind of a learning tool as well. You can really focus on that. There's lots more you can do. That's all I'm going to show you there for now. Let's go to our last two tools, and those are both part of this LexTutor.ca. Here's my keywords extractor. Now, sometimes when you're reading a text, you can feel like, oh, if it's using the same 6 difficult words over and over again, and I'm having to look it up every time, right? Well, this tool is going to help you pull those out. So let's say you just, once and for all, you'd like a list of all these kind of specialist technical words that this text is using. What I've just done is I've just copied and pasted that same excerpt here. And with this tool, the longer the better. So we'll see what we get with just this paragraph. But I just copied and pasted. I'm going to press submit. It's going to give me some information. So here you can skip all this technical information and just focus on this numbered list here. This is giving me looks like 13 most key words from this text, and those are words that were used in this text more often than other texts. So there, I might already know the word relation, but maybe efficacy is a good one, maybe causal, correlate, those are really good words. I write those down, I learn them, and then as I continue to read the text, I'm seeing these words over and over again. I've learned what they mean. It's great. So that's a keyword generator. You can also use this just to learn vocabulary. That's fine. The last tool is a vocab profiler. So what I'm going to do here is just copy and paste that same text. And again, I'm going to press submit. So I'm copying and pasting and pressing submit. Let's see what I get. So this is telling me some different information. You can see some different colors. Let's go through. it says in my text, I'm using almost all, so 3/4 of my words are from the first 1,000 most common words in English, and then a further 3% from the next 2,000. So at your level, you probably don't care about that at all. So most of my text is common English words, because and the and with and all those kinds of words. But if you look at this yellow AWL words, now that stands for academic word list words, which we just talked about a moment ago. And this text is about 13% words from the academic word list. So if I scroll down, it's actually going to show me, if you can see here on the right, it's all color-coded. So if I want to use a text I'm reading and pull out those academic words, I can use this tool and then focus on these yellow words and see how they're being used in my text. It can also be a learning tool. If you're trying to learn those academic words, you can use this tool. Now, the red are words that are not in those three categories. So they might be specialist, or they might be just very uncommon. I can see pellagra, for example. That's a technical uncommon word, so that's not. But I can see these beautifully colored yellow academic word list words, and that can help me kind of break down a text and see what's going on a vocabulary level. So those are a few tools for working with text. Again, it was literally just copying and pasting and pressing submit, fiddling with the settings and seeing some things I can learn about the words in my academic texts. Thank you for listening to this lecture. I want you to remember, reading is a skill and it can be improved with practice. We've given you a few tools, for example, SQ3R to help you kind of work through academic texts. Remember that the reading stage of SQ3R comes in the middle. So don't forget, when you're picking up your academic text, you want to survey and question first, and then you read. And remember also that for all I said that reading for pleasure is something different than reading for academic purposes, that is true, but any reading that you do is really going to help you improve your skills. So don't be afraid to pick up a novel now and then to help you, even in your academic reading. Thank you for listening to the lecture. I wish you the best in your academic reading.